The gunshot that shattered the late afternoon silence sent Belle Easton diving behind a water trough, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs wide open. She had come to Reno, Nevada in the spring of 1878 with nothing but a carpet bag full of her mother's old dresses and a faded photograph of the father she had never known. Her mother had died 3 months earlier in a cramped boarding house in San Francisco, leaving Belle with only whispered stories about a man who had once loved them both before disappearing into the vast wilderness of the West. Belle was 22 years old, and she had promised her mother on her deathbed that she would find him, or at least discover what had become of him. But Reno was not the hopeful frontier town she had imagined. It was rougher, wilder, and far more dangerous than the streets of San Francisco had ever been. Men fought over card games in broad daylight. Women with painted faces called out from saloon windows. And now someone was shooting, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing off the wooden storefronts that lined Virginia Street. Belle pressed herself against the rough wood of the trough, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had started, replaced by the sound of boots running on the packed dirt street and men shouting. She waited, counting her heartbeats, before she dared to peek over the edge of the trough. A man lay sprawled in the street about 30 feet away, blood spreading dark across his shirt. Several townspeople were gathering around him, and Belle recognized the doctor who had treated her for a fever her first week in town, hurrying across the street with his black bag. This was the third shooting she had witnessed in the 2 months since her arrival, and each time it left her shaken and questioning whether she should simply return to California. But she could not. She had given her word. Belle waited until the crowd had moved the wounded man inside the saloon before she stood, brushing dust from her gray traveling dress. Her hands were trembling, and she clasped them together tightly. She had been on her way to the boarding house where she rented a small room on the 2nd floor, returning from her job at the dry goods store where she worked 6 days a week measuring fabric and counting out nails and buttons for the miners and ranchers who came to town for supplies. The work was honest but exhausting, and it barely paid enough to cover her room and board. She had saved only a few dollars toward the cost of hiring someone to help her search for information about her father, Samuel Easton, who had supposedly worked as a ranch hand somewhere in the territory before she was born. She continued walking, her steps quick, trying to ignore the way her stomach twisted with fear and homesickness. The mountains rose purple and gold in the distance, beautiful and forbidding all at once. The Truckee River rushed past the edge of town, its waters cold and swift with snowmelt from the Sierra Nevada. Belle had just reached the corner near the boarding house when she heard it. Music. A man's voice, rich and warm, singing a melody that stopped her in her tracks so abruptly that she nearly stumbled. The song was one her mother had sung to her every night when she was a child, a haunting tune about a bird that flew over mountains searching for home. Her mother had told her it was an old folk song from her own childhood in Missouri, passed down from her grandmother. Belle had not heard anyone else sing it in all her life. It was uniquely theirs, a private treasure she had thought existed nowhere else in the world. Yet here it was, floating on the evening air, coming from somewhere nearby. Belle followed the sound as if pulled by invisible strings. The voice led her past the boarding house, past the small white church with its simple steeple, toward the livery stable at the edge of town. The building was weathered gray, and the smell of hay and horses drifted from the open doors. The voice was coming from inside. She approached slowly, her curiosity overwhelming her usual caution. Through the wide doorway, she could see a man sitting on a barrel, his back to her, his dark hat pushed back on his head. He was brushing down a chestnut mare, his movements easy and practiced, and he sang as he worked. The words were exactly as her mother had sung them, not a syllable different. Belle's throat tightened with emotion. Hearing that song in this rough frontier town felt like receiving a message from beyond the grave, as if her mother was reaching out to remind her why she had come here, what she had promised. The man must have sensed her presence because he stopped singing mid-verse and turned. Belle found herself looking into a pair of striking hazel eyes set in a weathered, handsome face. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, with strong features bronzed by sun and wind, and dark hair that curled slightly where it touched his collar. A shadow of stubble covered his jaw, and there was a small scar above his left eyebrow that gave him a roguish appearance. "Can I help you, miss?" His voice held a hint of the South, vowels stretched just slightly longer than the clipped speech she was used to in California. Belle realized she was staring and felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I apologize for intruding. I heard you singing and that song. Where did you learn that song?" The man set down his brush and stood, revealing a tall, lean frame clothed in dusty work clothes and worn boots. He regarded her with obvious curiosity, his eyes traveling from her face down to her sensible shoes and back up again in a way that was assessing, but not disrespectful. "That is an interesting question to be asked by a stranger," he said slowly. "Might I know who is asking? My name is Belle Easton. I work at Henderson's dry goods store." She took a small step closer, emboldened by her desperate need to know. "That song was special to my mother. I have never heard anyone else sing it. Please, where did you learn it?" Something shifted in the man's expression. He removed his hat, revealing more of his face, and held it loosely in his hands. "My name is Quentin Zachary. Most folks call me Quinn. I learned that song from an old ranch hand who worked my family's spread down in Texas before the war. He taught it to me when I was just a boy." "Texas," Belle repeated, her mind racing. "My father was from Texas originally, or so my mother told me." Quinn's eyebrows rose slightly. "That is quite a coincidence." "Is it?" Belle felt her pulse quicken. "I came to Reno looking for information about my father. He disappeared before I was born, but my mother said he had moved to Nevada to work on ranches. His name was Samuel Easton." She watched Quinn's face carefully, looking for any sign of recognition, but he shook his head slowly. "I am sorry, miss. That name means nothing to me. I have only been in Nevada for about 6 months myself. Before that, I was drifting through Colorado and Wyoming, doing ranch work wherever I could find it." Disappointment settled heavy in Belle's chest, though she was not sure what she had expected. "Of course. It was foolish of me to think there would be a connection." "Wait." Quinn held up a hand. "Do not rush off. That song means something to you, clearly, and I did not mean to cause you distress by singing it. If you would like, I could tell you more about where I learned it. The old man who taught me, his name was Joseph Carter, and he had traveled all over the West. Perhaps he crossed paths with your father at some point." Belle hesitated. Every instinct told her to be cautious around strange men in this wild town, but there was something in Quinn's manner that seemed genuine, something that made her want to trust him. Perhaps it was simply that he had been singing her mother's song, creating an inexplicable bond between them. "I would appreciate that," she said quietly. "Though I should return to my boarding house. It will be dark soon, and the landlady worries if I am out late." Quinn nodded. "I understand. Would you allow me to walk you back? The streets can be dangerous after the sun sets, especially with all the trouble lately." "You mean the shooting this afternoon? That and other things." "There has been tension between some of the ranchers and a group of miners who think they have claim to water rights that the ranchers say belong to them. It has made everyone quick to anger." Quinn reached for a worn leather vest hanging on a nail and shrugged it on. "I try to stay out of such disputes, but they have a way of pulling everyone in whether they like it or not." They walked together back toward the center of town, Quinn leading his horse, a sturdy bay gelding with a white star on its forehead. The sun was sinking toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost too vivid to be real. "Tell me about this Joseph Carter," Belle said as they walked. "What was he like?" Quinn's expression softened with memory. "He was old when I knew him, his hair white as snow and his hands gnarled with arthritis. But he was the best horseman I ever saw, and he could play the fiddle like an angel. He had worked cattle drives from Texas all the way to Montana, seen the country when it was even wilder than it is now. He told stories that would keep us boys awake all night, tales of stampedes and outlaws and Indian raids. He sounds remarkable." "He was. He died when I was about 15, and I have missed him ever since. He was more of a father to me than my own ever was." There was a note of bitterness in Quinn's voice that he did not elaborate on, and Belle did not press. They had reached the boarding house, a two-story building with a sagging porch and windows that glowed with lamplight. Belle stopped at the bottom of the steps and turned to face Quinn. "Thank you for walking me back, Mr. Zachary." "Quinn, please. And it was my pleasure, Miss Easton." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "Would you allow me to call on you? I feel like we have a connection through that song, strange as it sounds. And I would like to help you search for information about your father if I can." Belle's heart gave an unexpected flutter. She barely knew this man, yet she felt drawn to him in a way that both thrilled and frightened her. "I would like that," she heard herself say. "I work at the store most days until 5 o'clock. Then I will come by tomorrow after you finish work if that suits you." "It does." Quinn tipped his hat to her, and Belle climbed the steps to the boarding house, very aware of his eyes on her back. She resisted the urge to turn and look at him again before she opened the door and stepped inside. The landlady, Mrs. Cooper, was setting the table for supper in the dining room. She was a stout woman in her 50s with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, but her eyes were kind. "You are late tonight, dear," she said when she saw Belle. "I was beginning to worry. There was a shooting on Virginia Street, and I had to wait until it was safe to pass." Belle untied her bonnet and hung it on the rack by the door. "I am sorry to have worried you." "This town grows more lawless by the day," Mrs. Cooper said, shaking her head. "Sometimes I think about selling this place and moving somewhere more civilized, Seattle perhaps, or back east." But Belle knew she would never do it. Mrs. Cooper had lived in Reno for 20 years, since before it was even properly a town, and she loved it despite its roughness. Supper was simple but filling. Beef stew with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread, and dried apple pie for dessert. Belle sat with the other 3 boarders, 2 miners and an elderly clerk from the land office, and listened to them discuss the shooting and the ongoing dispute over water rights. She contributed little to the conversation, her mind occupied with thoughts of Quinn Zachary and the impossible coincidence of hearing her mother's song. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the small room that held all her earthly possessions, Belle found sleep elusive. Through her window, she could see stars scattered thick across the black sky, more stars than she had ever seen in San Francisco, where coal smoke and fog obscured the heavens. She thought about her mother, about the promises she had made, about the handsome stranger who had somehow learned a song that should have been known only to her family. She thought about the way Quinn's eyes had looked in the fading light, warm and interested and genuine. And she thought about tomorrow, when she would see him again. The next day dragged interminably. Belle measured yards of calico for a rancher's wife, weighed out nails for a carpenter, and wrapped parcels with string until her fingers ached. She kept glancing at the clock on the wall, watching the hands creep forward with agonizing slowness. Mr. Henderson, the store's owner, noticed her distraction. "You seem restless today, Miss Easton. Are you feeling well?" "Perfectly well, thank you, sir. Just a bit tired, perhaps." He grunted and returned to his ledgers. He was a fair employer, if somewhat gruff, and he had never given Belle any reason to complain. The work was honest, the pay was regular, and he did not try to take liberties as some men might with a young woman alone in the world. When 5 o'clock finally arrived, Belle removed her work apron and retrieved her bonnet. Her hands were shaking slightly as she tied the ribbons, and she silently chided herself for acting like a silly girl. Quinn was simply being kind. He had offered to help her search for her father, nothing more. But when she stepped outside and saw him waiting across the street, leaning against a hitching post with his hat tipped back, and the evening sun gilding his profile, her breath caught in her throat in a way that had nothing to do with simple kindness. He straightened when he saw her and crossed the street with long, easy strides. "Good evening, Belle. I hope you do not mind that I call you Belle." "Not at all." Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Did you have something particular in mind?" "I thought we might walk along the river while there is still light. I have been thinking about what you told me last night about your father. I stopped by the land office today and asked if they had any records of a Samuel Easton filing a claim or purchasing property. They have records going back to when Nevada became a territory, but there was nothing under that name." Belle tried not to let her disappointment show. "I appreciate you taking the time to check. I have asked at several places since I arrived, but no one remembers hearing the name." They walked together toward the river, the sound of rushing water growing louder as they left the main street behind. The Truckee was beautiful in the slanted light, its surface catching gold and silver as it tumbled over rocks. Cottonwood trees grew along the banks, their leaves whispering in the breeze. "Tell me more about your mother," Quinn said. "What was she like?" Belle found herself talking more freely than she had expected, perhaps because Quinn listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and never interrupting. She told him about her childhood in San Francisco, about her mother's work as a seamstress, about the small apartment they had shared, and the way her mother would sing while she worked, her needle flashing in the lamplight as she created beautiful things from plain cloth. "She never spoke ill of my father," Belle said. "Even though he left her alone and expecting a child, she always said he must have had good reasons, that he had loved her truly even if circumstances pulled them apart. I think she spent her whole life hoping he would come back. But he never did." "No, and now I will never know what happened to him or whether he ever thought of us at all." Belle's throat tightened and she looked away, not wanting Quinn to see the tears that threatened. Quinn was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. "My father was a hard man. He believed in discipline above all else, and he had no patience for weakness or sentiment. After my mother died when I was 8, he became even harder. He drank too much and took out his anger on whoever was near, usually me. Joseph Carter was the only one who showed me any kindness in those years." "I am so sorry." Belle looked at him, seeing the shadow of old pain in his eyes. "I left home when I was 17 and never went back. Last I heard, the old man was still running the ranch, mean as a snake and twice as bitter. I have no family to speak of, no ties anywhere. I am free to go where I want and do as I please, but sometimes that freedom feels less like a blessing and more like loneliness." They had reached a bend in the river where someone had left a fallen log near the water's edge. Quinn gestured to it, and they sat together, watching the water flow past. Belle was acutely aware of his nearness, the way his shoulder almost touched hers, the warmth radiating from his body in the cooling evening air. "That song," she said softly. "Would you tell me more about how Joseph taught it to you?" Quinn picked up a small stone and tossed it into the water, watching the ripples spread. "I must have been about 10 years old. My father had beaten me particularly badly that day for some small infraction I do not even remember. I was hiding in the barn, crying like the child I was, and Joseph found me. He sat with me and told me a story about a bird that got lost in a storm but kept flying until it found its way home. Then he sang me that song, the one you heard yesterday. He said his own mother had sung it to him when he was a boy in Tennessee, and that it had the power to heal hurts that medicine could not touch." Belle felt tears spill down her cheeks. "My mother said almost the same thing. She said it was a song for mending broken hearts." "Then perhaps that is why we both needed to learn it," Quinn said quietly. He turned to look at her, and the expression in his eyes made her pulse race. "I have not been able to stop thinking about you since last night, Belle. I know we have only just met, but I feel as if I have been searching for you without even knowing it. I feel the same way." The words were barely a whisper. "It does not make sense. Things like this do not happen in real life. Maybe they do. Maybe we just do not hear about them because people are afraid to believe in coincidences that feel like miracles." Quinn reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumb. "I would very much like to kiss you right now, if you would allow it." Belle's answer was to lean toward him, closing the small distance between them. When his lips met hers, soft and warm and tentative, she felt something shift and settle into place in her chest, as if a piece of her that had always been missing had finally been found. The kiss was brief, gentle, but it left her breathless and wanting more. Quinn pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against hers, his hand cupping her cheek. "I will help you find out what happened to your father," he said. "I promise you that. But I also need you to know that whatever we discover, whatever the truth turns out to be, I am here. I am not going anywhere." Belle believed him. Perhaps it was foolish to trust so quickly, to give her heart to a man she had known for only 2 days, but something in Quinn's touch, in his voice, in the way he looked at her, told her he was speaking truth. They sat by the river until the stars began to appear, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's thoughts and dreams and fears. Quinn told her about the places he had seen in his travels, the mountains of Colorado dusted with snow even in summer, the endless grasslands of Wyoming where the wind never stopped blowing, the rough mining camps and quiet ranch valleys that made up the patchwork of the West. Belle told him about San Francisco, about the fog that rolled in from the bay every evening, about the ships in the harbor with their tall masts, and the sailors from distant countries who filled the streets with strange languages and exotic goods. "Would you go back?" Quinn asked. "If you do not find what you are looking for here?" Belle considered the question. "I do not know. San Francisco holds mostly sad memories now. My mother is buried there, but I have no other ties. I came here partly to honor her wishes, but also because I hope to find a new beginning for myself." "And have you found a beginning, I mean?" She looked at him, at the way the starlight caught in his eyes, and smiled. "I think perhaps I have." Over the following weeks, Belle and Quinn spent every possible moment together. He would meet her after work each day, and they would walk through Reno's streets or along the river. Or sometimes he would borrow a wagon and take her out to see the sagebrush plains that stretched toward the mountains. On Sundays, when the store was closed, they would pack a simple lunch and ride out to find quiet spots where the world seemed to belong only to them. Quinn continued to work at the livery stable. earning his keep by caring for the horses and doing odd jobs around town. He was saving money, he told Belle, toward buying his own piece of land someday, a small ranch where he could raise horses and cattle and build a life worth having. "Would you like to have a family?" Belle asked him one Sunday afternoon as they lay on a blanket beneath a cottonwood tree, watching clouds drift across the blue sky. "I would," Quinn said. "If I could be the kind of father Joseph was to me, patient and kind instead of angry and cruel. I want children to grow up knowing they are loved, not feared. You would be a wonderful father." Belle said it with complete certainty. In the time she had known Quinn, she had seen only gentleness in him, a quiet strength that needed no violence to prove itself. He rolled onto his side to look at her, propping himself up on one elbow. "And you would be a beautiful mother, kind and strong like your mother must have been." They had not yet spoken directly about the future in terms of the two of them together, but the implication hung in the air between them, sweet and full of promise. Belle reached up to trace the line of his jaw, feeling the slight roughness of stubble beneath her fingertips. "I love you, Quinn Zachary. I know it has only been a few weeks, but I am certain of it." His face lit with a smile that transformed him, erasing the shadows of his past and revealing the man he was meant to be. "I love you too, Belle Easton. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I turned around and saw you standing in the doorway of that stable." He kissed her then, deeper and more passionate than before, his arms wrapping around her and pulling her close. Belle gave herself over to the sensation, her fingers tangling in his hair, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Quinn's eyes were dark with desire. "Marry me," he said. "I know I have nothing to offer you but myself, and whatever future we can build together, but marry me, Belle, be my wife." "Yes," she did not hesitate. "Yes, Quinn, I will marry you." They set the date for a month away, wanting to be properly married in the small church with Mrs. Cooper and the few friends they had made in Reno as witnesses. Belle wrote a letter to her mother's sister in Missouri, the only family she had left, though she did not expect a response in time for the wedding. The weeks that followed were filled with preparations. Belle bought fabric from Henderson's store at a discount and stayed up late in her room sewing a simple but pretty dress of ivory cotton with lace trim at the collar and cuffs. Mrs. Cooper, delighted at the prospect of a wedding, insisted on baking the cake and hosting a small reception at the boarding house afterward. But even in the midst of her happiness, Belle could not forget the quest that had brought her to Reno. She and Quinn continued to search for any trace of her father, asking questions of old-timers in saloons, checking records at the courthouse, following leads that always seemed to go nowhere. Then, 3 weeks before the wedding, they finally found something. Quinn had been talking to a freight hauler who made regular runs between Reno and the smaller settlements in the surrounding valleys. The man mentioned that he had once delivered supplies to a ranch owned by a family named Easton, though that had been years ago, and he thought the place had long since been abandoned. "Did he say where?" Belle asked, gripping Quinn's arm. "About 15 miles north of here, up toward Honey Lake Valley. He said the ranch was in a small canyon with a creek running through it. He remembered it because the woman who lived there was kind to him, always offered him coffee and a meal before he headed back." A woman. Belle's heart raced. Did he say what her name was? He could not remember. "But Belle, even if we find this place, even if someone named Easton did live there once, it might not be your father. Easton is not such an uncommon name." "I know, but I have to try. We have come this far," Quinn nodded. "Then we will go. Tomorrow is Saturday. We can leave early and be back before dark if we push hard." That night, Belle lay awake imagining what they might find. She pictured a kindly old man who would embrace her and weep with joy at discovering he had a daughter. She pictured a grave marker that would at least give her closure. She pictured 100 different scenarios, each one ending differently. They left at dawn, riding Quinn's horse together with Belle seated in front of him, his arms secure around her waist. The morning was cool and clear, the air sharp with the scent of sage and pine. They followed the freight hauler's directions, heading north on a rough track that wound between rocky hills covered in scattered junipers. The land was harsh but beautiful, colored in shades of gold and gray and green. They saw antelope grazing in the distance and a golden eagle soaring high overhead. The sun climbed higher, warming their backs, and Belle allowed herself to simply enjoy the ride, the feel of Quinn's solid presence behind her, the power of the horse beneath them. Around midday, they found the canyon. It was just as the freight hauler had described, a narrow cleft between two hills with a small creek running through it. The remains of a ranch house stood near the water, its roof partially collapsed, and its walls weathered gray by years of wind and sun. Quinn reined in the horse, and they sat for a moment looking at the abandoned structure. Belle felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You want me to come with you?" Quinn asked quietly. "Please." They dismounted, and Quinn tied the horse to a sturdy juniper before they walked together toward the house. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, and the windows were empty of glass. Inside, the single room was dim and smelled of dust and animal nests. There was an old iron stove in one corner, a broken chair, and not much else. But on the wall near the stove, someone had carefully scratched words into the wood. Belle approached slowly, her heart in her throat, and read what was written there: Samuel and Mary Easton, 1852. "Mary was my grandmother's name," Belle whispered. "My mother told me she was named after her." Quinn squeezed her shoulder gently. "So your father was here. This was his place." They searched the cabin thoroughly but found nothing else except a few rusted tools and some broken crockery. Outside, they discovered the remains of a barn and a corral, the fence posts leaning at drunken angles, the rails long since fallen and rotting. "There." Quinn pointed to a spot on a small rise beyond the corral where two pieces of wood stood upright. "Those look like markers." They climbed the rise together. The wooden markers were weathered almost smooth, but Belle could still make out names carved into them. Samuel Easton, born 1828, died 1855. Mary Easton, born 1830, died 1855. Belle stared at the markers, trying to make sense of the dates. Her father had died in 1855. She had been born in 1856. The timeline made no sense at all. "I do not understand," she said. "If he died in 1855, then he could not be my father. My mother said they were together in 1856, that he left her that spring when she told him she was expecting me." Quinn knelt and studied the markers more closely. "Belle, look at this. The carving on Samuel's marker is different from Mary's. See how the letters are shaped. It is as if two different people made them at different times." Belle knelt beside him, looking where he pointed. He was right. Mary's name was carved in neat, careful letters. Samuel's name was rougher, less certain, as if whoever had carved it was less skilled or perhaps carving through tears. "What if?" Quinn said slowly. "What if this is not your father? What if there was another Samuel Easton, maybe a brother or a cousin?" Hope flared in Belle's chest. "My mother said my father told her he had a brother who died young, but she never knew details." They searched the area around the graves but found nothing else. No other markers, no evidence of who had lived here or what had happened to them. As the afternoon sun began to slant lower, Quinn gently suggested they should head back. "We can come again," he said. We can ask more questions in Reno, see if any of the old-timers remember the people who lived here. Belle took one last look at the abandoned ranch, trying to imagine her father here as a young man, trying to picture the life he might have lived. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said. "Even if we did not find all the answers, at least we found something." On the ride back to Reno, Belle leaned against Quinn's chest and let herself be comforted by his steady heartbeat. They spoke little, both lost in thought, but his arms around her waist were warm and strong, and she knew that whatever mysteries remained about her past, her future was secure in the love they shared. That evening, back at the boarding house, Mrs. Cooper mentioned that a man had come by asking for Belle while she was out. "He said he was an old friend of your mother's from San Francisco. He heard you were in Reno and wanted to see you. I told him you would be back this evening." Belle exchanged a puzzled glance with Quinn. "Did he give his name?" "He did, though I am afraid I do not remember it. William something, I think. He said he would return tomorrow afternoon." Belle could not think of anyone named William who had been a friend of her mother's, but she supposed there were many people her mother had known that Belle had never met. She thanked Mrs. Cooper and went upstairs to change out of her dusty riding clothes. The next afternoon, Belle was sitting in the boarding house parlor working on the trim for her wedding dress when Mrs. Cooper showed in a visitor. The man was perhaps in his late 40s, well dressed in a dark suit and carrying a leather satchel. His face was kind but worn, with deep lines around his eyes and mouth. "Miss Easton, my name is William Emerson. I knew your mother many years ago in San Francisco, and I was deeply saddened to hear of her passing." Belle set aside her sewing and stood. "Thank you for your condolences, Mr. Emerson. Please, sit down. Can I offer you coffee or tea?" "Coffee would be welcome, thank you." Mrs. Cooper bustled off to fetch refreshments while Belle and William Emerson sat in the worn parlor chairs. Quinn had promised to come by later, after he finished his work at the stable, but Belle wished he was here now. There was something in the way this man looked at her that made her uneasy, though she could not have said why. "I suppose you are wondering why I have sought you out," William said once Mrs. Cooper had served the coffee and departed. "The truth is, I have information about your father that your mother asked me to give you if anything should happen to her. She wrote to me last year when she first became ill and made me promise to find you and tell you the truth." Belle's heart began to pound. "The truth about what?" William set down his coffee cup and opened his satchel, withdrawing a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. "Your mother and father were married, Miss Easton. Properly married in a church in San Francisco in the spring of 1855. His name was Samuel Thomas Easton, and he was the younger brother of Samuel William Easton, who died with his wife Mary at that ranch you visited yesterday." Belle stared at him. "How did you know I went to the ranch?" "I have been making inquiries around Reno for the past several days, trying to find you. I heard you had been asking questions about Samuel Easton. I went to that ranch myself many years ago, which is how I knew where to direct you if you asked." "You knew about the ranch. You knew about my father, and you never told my mother where he was." William's face creased with sorrow. "Because I did not know myself, not for certain. Let me explain." He handed her the bundle of letters. "These are letters your father wrote to your mother over the course of several years. Read them, and you will understand." With trembling hands, Belle untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. The handwriting was firm and clear, the words full of love and longing. Her father wrote of his grief over his brother's death, of his need to settle his brother's affairs and see to the ranch before he could return to San Francisco. He promised he would come back as soon as possible. The second letter was dated 6 months later. Her father wrote of difficulties with the ranch, of debts his brother had accrued that he was trying to pay. He again promised to return soon. The third letter was dated nearly a year after the first. Her father's tone had changed, become more distant. He wrote that he had met someone in Nevada, a widow with a young son, and that he had decided to stay and help her run her deceased husband's ranch. He asked your mother to forgive him and to try to forget him. Belle looked up at William, tears blurring her vision. He abandoned us. He married my mother and then left her for someone else. Keep reading, William said gently. The fourth letter was brief and written in a shaking hand. Her father wrote that he was dying, that he had been injured in a fall from a horse, and the wounds had become infected. He begged for forgiveness and said his greatest regret was never meeting his daughter. He asked that someone tell Belle, when she was old enough to understand, that he had loved her mother truly, and that leaving them was the worst mistake of his life. The final letter was from the widow, whose name was Elizabeth Porter. She wrote to inform Belle's mother that Samuel had died and been buried on her ranch, and that in his final days he had spoken of nothing but the wife and daughter he had left behind. Elizabeth wrote that she was deeply sorry for the pain her relationship with Samuel had caused and that if she could take it back, she would. Belle set the letters down in her lap, her hands shaking. All these years, her mother had known the truth and had chosen to protect Belle from it, to let her believe her father was a good man who had been kept away by circumstances beyond his control. Your mother loved you very much, William said quietly. She did not want you to grow up thinking your father had willingly abandoned you for another woman. She wanted you to believe the best of him. Where is he buried? Belle asked, her voice hoarse. On the Porter Ranch, about 20 miles east of here. Elizabeth Porter sold the ranch several years ago and moved to Carson City. I spoke with her before coming to find you. She said if you wanted to visit your father's grave, the new owners would allow it. Quinn arrived a short time later and found Belle still sitting in the parlor, the letters scattered around her, tears streaming down her face. He took one look at the scene and crossed to her immediately, pulling her into his arms. What happened? Belle, sweetheart, talk to me. William Emerson quietly explained while Belle wept against Quinn's chest. When he finished, Quinn's arms tightened around her, and he pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I am so sorry, he murmured. I am so sorry you had to learn this. After William Emerson left, promising to send Belle the address of the Porter Ranch, Quinn held Belle while she cried out her grief and disappointment and anger. She wept for her mother, who had carried this burden alone. She wept for the father she had never known, who had made such terrible choices. She wept for the child she had been, who had grown up without a father because he had chosen to leave. He was just a man, Quinn said when her tears finally subsided. Flawed and imperfect like all of us. He made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but in the end he regretted them. That has to count for something. Does it? Belle pulled back to look at him, her eyes red and swollen. He left my mother to raise me alone in poverty while he played at being a rancher and a husband to someone else. He had years to come back to make things right, but he never did. And my mother let me believe he was a good man when he was not. Quinn cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. Your mother let you believe in love and honor and keeping promises. She gave you hope instead of bitterness. That was a gift, Belle, even if it hurts now to know the truth. I do not want to visit his grave, Belle said. I do not want to see where he is buried or speak to Elizabeth Porter or hear any more details about his life without us. I want to let him rest and try to move forward. Then that is what we will do. Quinn kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. We will move forward together. We will build the life your father should have built with your mother. We will keep our promises to each other, Belle. I swear it. I know you will. She leaned into him, drawing strength from his solidity. I love you, Quinn. You are the only family I need. The wedding took place on a bright Sunday morning in June, with wildflowers blooming in the meadows and the sky a brilliant blue overhead. Belle wore her ivory dress with her hair pinned up, and a simple crown of daisies that Mrs. Cooper had picked that morning. Quinn wore his only suit, brushed clean and pressed, with a new white shirt that Belle had made for him as a wedding gift. They stood before the minister in the little church and spoke their vows, promising to love and honor each other for all the days of their lives. When Quinn slipped a simple gold band on Belle's finger, his hands were shaking, and when Belle repeated her vows, her voice was thick with emotion. "You may kiss your bride," the minister said, and Quinn did not need to be told twice. He pulled Belle into his arms and kissed her with such tender passion that several of the ladies in the small congregation sighed with romantic approval. The reception at the boarding house was simple but joyful. Mrs. Cooper's cake was delicious, and there was cold lemonade and sandwiches and fruit preserves. Someone brought a fiddle, and there was dancing in the parlor, though the space was cramped. Belle danced with Quinn, her new husband, and felt as if her feet did not touch the ground. That night, they consummated their marriage in the small room Belle had been renting, which would be theirs for another week, until they could move into a tiny house Quinn had found on the edge of town. He was gentle and patient with her, conscious of her inexperience, and when they finally came together as man and wife, Belle felt such overwhelming love that she wept again, though this time with joy. "Are you all right?" Quinn asked anxiously, holding her close afterward, their bodies still joined. "I am perfect," Belle whispered. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be. The years that followed were not always easy, but they were good." Quinn worked hard, first at the livery stable, and then doing ranch work for various spreads around Reno, saving every dollar he could. Belle continued to work at the dry goods store until she became pregnant with their first child, a son they named Samuel Joseph, honoring both Belle's father and Quinn's beloved mentor. Little Sam was born in the spring of 1880, during a late snowstorm that left the mountains white and the air cold and sharp. Belle labored for 18 hours with Mrs. Cooper and a midwife in attendance while Quinn paced in the kitchen below, wearing a track in the floor. When he finally heard his son's first cry, he burst into tears of relief and joy. "He is perfect," Belle said when Quinn came upstairs to meet his son. "He has your eyes and your stubborn chin." Quinn held his son for the first time with such tenderness that Belle fell in love with him all over again. "I promise you," Quinn whispered to the baby, "I will be the father mine never was. I will love you and protect you and teach you to be a good man." And he kept that promise. As Sam grew from baby to toddler to young boy, Quinn was patient and kind, teaching him to ride and rope and care for animals, but also teaching him to read and to treat all people with respect and to stand up for what was right. They had 2 more children in the years that followed, a daughter named Catherine Rose in 1882, and another son named Thomas William in 1885. Quinn finally saved enough money to buy a small piece of land north of Reno, not far from where Belle's uncle's ranch had been, and there he built a house with his own hands, a sturdy structure with 3 bedrooms and a wide porch that faced the mountains. They raised horses and cattle, worked side by side from dawn until dusk, and built a life that was exactly what they had both dreamed of. The children grew up strong and healthy, knowing they were loved, their home filled with laughter and music. And Quinn still sang that old song, the one that had brought him and Belle together. He sang it to their children when they were sick or scared or sad, and later he taught it to them so they could sing it with him. It became a family tradition, that song, a thread connecting generations and carrying forward the memory of Belle's mother and Quinn's Joseph Carter. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Quinn surprised Belle by taking her back to the spot by the Truckee River where he had first kissed her. The log where they had sat was long gone, washed away by spring floods, but the place was still beautiful, still peaceful. "You ever regret it?" Quinn asked as they sat on the bank, watching the water flow past. "Marrying a drifter with nothing to his name. You could have done better, found a richer man with more prospects." Belle took his hand and laced their fingers together. "I found exactly the man I was meant to find. Everything that happened, all the pain and the searching and the disappointment, it all led me here to you. I would not change a single moment." Quinn pulled her close and kissed her, and Belle thought about the girl she had been 10 years ago, frightened and alone in a strange town, searching for a father she would never really find. She thought about hearing that song drifting from the stable and following it to Quinn. She thought about all the small miracles and coincidences that had brought them together. "I learned it just for you," Quinn said softly, and it took Belle a moment to understand he was talking about the song. "That is not quite true, is it? Joseph taught me when I was a boy. But after I met you, after I learned what that song meant to you, I would sing it every night before I slept, practicing to make sure I got every word right. Because even then, after only one meeting, I knew you were special. I knew I wanted to deserve you. You always deserved me," Belle said. "You are the best man I have ever known, Quinn Zachary." They sat by the river until the stars came out, talking and laughing and remembering, their love as strong as it had been on their wedding day, perhaps even stronger for having been tested and proven true. By the time they celebrated their 20th anniversary in 1898, their children were nearly grown. Sam, at 18, was working the ranch alongside his father and courting a girl from town. Catherine, at 16, was beautiful and clever and wanted to go to college in San Francisco to study teaching. Thomas, at 13, was still boyish and full of mischief, but showed signs of becoming as solid and dependable as his father. Belle and Quinn were in their 40s now, their hair showing touches of gray, their faces marked by years of wind and sun. But they were still strong, still healthy, still deeply in love. "I want to take you somewhere," Quinn said one evening after supper. "Will you ride with me tomorrow?" Belle agreed, curious, and the next morning they left the children in charge of the ranch and rode out together. Quinn led her north and east, into country she had not seen in many years, and Belle realized with a start where they were going. "The ranch," she said. "My uncle's ranch." "Why?" "You will see." The canyon looked much as it had 20 years earlier, though the old cabin had finally collapsed completely, leaving only scattered timbers and the stone foundation. But the creek still ran clear and cold, and wildflowers bloomed along its banks. Quinn helped Belle down from her horse and led her to the rise where the grave markers had stood. They were gone now, rotted away to nothing, but Quinn had brought new markers, beautifully carved from pine and sealed with oil to protect them from the weather. He set them carefully in place, tamping the earth around them to hold them secure. The names and dates were exactly as they had been on the old markers, but Quinn had added something new. Under Samuel William Easton's name, he had carved, "Beloved brother of Samuel Thomas Easton." Under Mary Easton's name, remembered by her family, Belle's eyes filled with tears. "Quinn, they deserve to be remembered," he said. "Whatever else happened, whatever mistakes were made, they were part of your family. They deserve for someone to know they lived and died here." Belle knelt by the markers and traced the letters with her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving them this." They stood together in the canyon for a long while, the sun warm on their backs, the sound of the creek a gentle music. Belle thought about all the threads that connected past to present, the way pain and joy were woven together into the fabric of every life. She thought about her mother and her father, her uncle and aunt, all the people who had come before and made her who she was. But mostly she thought about Quinn, about the miracle of finding him, about the life they had built together from nothing but love and determination, and a song that had somehow bridged the gap between two lonely people and made them whole. "I love you," she said, turning to face him. "I have loved you for 20 years, and I will love you for 20 more, and for every year after that until my heart stops beating." Quinn cupped her face in his calloused hands, his hazel eyes shining with emotion. "I am the luckiest man who ever lived," he said. "The day I started singing that song in the stable and you walked through the door, that was the day my real life began. Everything before that was just waiting. You are my home, Belle. You have always been my home." They kissed there among the wildflowers and the memories, husband and wife, partners in every sense, their love a testament to the power of hope and persistence, and believing in miracles even when logic said they were impossible. The years continued to pass. Sam married his sweetheart and took over more of the ranch work, allowing Quinn to slow down a bit as his body began to show the strain of decades of hard labor. Catherine did go to college, becoming a teacher just as she had dreamed, and eventually married a doctor and settled in Carson City. Thomas followed his father's path, becoming a horseman of such skill that people came from 3 counties over to buy his trained mounts. Belle and Quinn became grandparents, then great-grandparents. They watched their family grow and spread like the branches of a strong tree, each generation carrying forward the values they had instilled: kindness, honesty, hard work, and above all, the belief that love was worth fighting for. They never did find out exactly what had happened to Belle's father in those final years before his death, and after a while, Belle realized she did not need to know. The man her mother had loved was not the same man who had died on Elizabeth Porter's ranch. People changed, made mistakes, lived with regret. What mattered was not the mistakes but what you chose to do with the life you had left. Quinn had chosen to be better than his own father. Belle had chosen to honor her mother's memory by building the happy family her mother had been denied. Together, they had created something that would last beyond their own lives, a legacy of love that would ripple forward through time. On a warm afternoon in the summer of 1920, Quinn and Belle sat together on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over the mountains. They were both in their 60s now, their bodies slowed by age but their minds still sharp, their love undiminished by the passing years. "Sing me our song," Belle said, resting her head on Quinn's shoulder. And Quinn sang, his voice still rich despite his age, the melody as beautiful as it had been the first time she heard it 42 years earlier. Belle closed her eyes and let the music wash over her, remembering the girl she had been, the promises she had made, the long journey that had brought her here. When the song ended, she lifted her head and kissed Quinn's weathered cheek. "Thank you for learning it just for me." Quinn smiled, the same smile that had made her heart flutter all those years ago. "I would learn 1,000 songs if it would make you happy. I would do anything for you, Belle. I always have, I always will." They sat together as the stars began to appear, one by one, filling the vast Nevada sky with light. They had weathered storms and droughts, lean years and prosperous ones, loss and joy and everything in between. They had kept their promises to each other, built a life worth living, raised children who would carry their story forward. And it had all started with a song, a chance meeting, and 2 people brave enough to believe that sometimes the most impossible things were the ones most worth believing in. As the night deepened and the coyotes began to sing in the distance, Belle thought about the words her mother had said so long ago, that the song had the power to heal hearts that medicine could not touch. She understood now what her mother had meant. It was not the song itself that healed, but what the song represented. Hope, connection, the belief that we are never truly alone. Quinn had sung that song in a stable in Reno on a spring evening in 1878, and Belle had heard it and followed it and found not just a man, but a home, a future, a love that would sustain her through everything life brought. That was the real miracle, she thought. Not the coincidence of the song, but what came after. The choice to trust, to love, to build something lasting in a world that was often harsh and uncertain. The choice to believe that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe conspired to bring together two people who were meant to find each other. Belle reached for Quinn's hand, feeling the familiar roughness of his palm, the strength still present in his grip despite his age. He squeezed back, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the night sky deepen and the stars grow brighter. Two people who had long ago stopped being lonely strangers and had become, instead, each other's home. Their story would be passed down through the generations, told by their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The tale of how a woman searching for her father found instead a husband who would love her faithfully for more than 40 years. How a man running from a painful past found a future worth staying for. How a song learned in childhood became the thread that wove two lives together into something beautiful and lasting. And every time the story was told, someone would ask Quinn, "Did you really learn that song just for her?" And Quinn would smile and say, "I learned it long before I met her, but I kept it in my heart until the day she needed to hear it. And then I sang it and she came to me and my life finally made sense." Years later, after both Belle and Quinn had passed peacefully in their sleep within months of each other, their children found the bundle of letters Belle had kept all those years, the ones from her father and from Elizabeth Porter. Tucked among them was a newer letter, one Belle had written but never sent, addressed to the father she had never known. In it, she wrote that she forgave him for his mistakes, that she understood now that people were complicated and imperfect, and that love did not always follow the path we expected. She wrote that she was grateful for the chain of events that had brought her to Nevada, because if he had stayed with her mother, if he had been the father he should have been, she might never have met Quinn. So perhaps everything happened exactly as it needed to, she had written. Perhaps all the pain and mistakes and wandering was necessary to bring me to the place I was meant to be, with the man I was meant to love. I like to think you would be happy knowing that your daughter found joy, even if it came from sorrow. I like to think you would approve of Quinn and the life we built together. And I like to think that wherever you are now you have found peace, and that you know I do not hate you. I never could because you gave me life, and that life, despite everything, has been beautiful. Sam, reading his mother's words many years after her death, wept for the grace she had shown, for the forgiveness she had granted to a man who had never asked for it. He shared the letter with his siblings, and they agreed to keep it with the other family documents, a testament to their mother's generous heart and her ability to find beauty even in pain. The ranch continued to prosper under Sam's stewardship and later under his sons. The house Quinn had built still stood, weathered but sturdy, a monument to his skill and determination. New generations were born and raised there, each one learning the old song, each one hearing the story of how their great-grandparents had met. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew down from the mountains, and the stars seemed close enough to touch, those who were sensitive to such things swore they could hear a man's voice singing, the melody haunting and sweet, filled with love that transcended death itself. The song Belle's mother had sung to her, that Joseph Carter had taught to a lonely boy, That Quinn had sung in a stable in Reno in 1878 became a legacy passed down through the generations. It was sung at weddings and christenings, at funerals and celebrations, a constant thread connecting past to present to future. And always, when someone new learned it, they were told the story about the girl who came to Nevada searching for her father and found her soulmate instead. About the man who had been taught that love was harsh and violent, but learned instead that love was gentle and patient and worth any sacrifice. About a song that had the power to heal, to connect, to transform two separate lives into one shared journey. In the end, that was the miracle. Not the coincidence, not the timing, not the impossible odds of two people finding each other in the vastness of the American West. The miracle was what they did with the gift they had been given. The way they chose each other every single day, through hardship and joy, through disappointment and triumph, through all the ordinary moments that make up a life. Quinn had sung a song, and Belle had followed it to him. But then came the real work. Building trust, creating partnership, raising a family, weathering storms both literal and metaphorical. And they had done it together, until death parted them, and even then, the love they had created continued on in the children and grandchildren who carried their blood and their values forward into the future. That was the story worth telling. Not just the romantic beginning, but the long middle and the peaceful end. The whole arc of a love that started with a song and ended, decades later, with two people who had lived fully and loved deeply and left the world better than they had found it. The Wild West that had seemed so harsh and unforgiving to young Belle Easton turned out to hold exactly what she needed. Not her father, not closure, not answers to all her questions, but something better, a partner, a purpose, a love that would sustain her through everything. And Quinn, who had come to Nevada running from his past, found in Belle a reason to stop running. A reason to put down roots, to build instead of drift, to become the man he had always had the potential to be. They saved each other, those two. Not in dramatic fashion, not with grand gestures, but in small, daily ways. With kindness and patience, with laughter and tears, with the simple act of choosing to stay, to commit, to love even when it was difficult. That was their legacy. Not wealth, not fame, not great historical significance. Just a life well lived, a love faithfully kept, a family raised with care and attention. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. And somewhere in the vast turning of the universe, in the mysterious workings of fate or providence or simple chance, a song had woven together two lives that were meant to be joined. A song learned in childhood, carried through years of loneliness, and finally shared at exactly the right moment with exactly the right person. Quinn had said he learned it just for Belle, and in a way, that was true. Everything in his life, every hardship and every joy, had been preparing him for the moment he would turn around in that stable and see her standing in the doorway, drawn by a melody that meant home and healing and love. And Belle, searching for a father she would never truly find, had instead found something better. A man who would never leave her, who would keep his promises, who would love her until his last breath and beyond. That was the story that mattered. That was the legacy that endured. Two people, a song and a love that lasted a lifetime. And if that was not a miracle, then perhaps miracles were simply everyday magic that we forget to notice. The magic of two hearts recognizing each other. The magic of choosing love over fear. The magic of building something lasting in a temporary world. Quinn and Belle knew that magic. They lived it every day. And their descendants, learning that old song and hearing their story, learned it too. Love was the answer. It always had been. Love was what healed the hurts that medicine could not touch. Love was what made a house a home, what turned strangers into family, what gave meaning to the long years and short days that made up a human life. Quinn sang a song. Belle heard it. And two lives became one story, a story of hope and healing and happily ever after. The end.